Can you explain the new reading screening test and why Decoding Dyslexia advocated for this new screening program?
Of course. So just a really quick background on where the requirement came from. Prior to July 2023, California was only one of a few states that did not mandate screening for reading risk or dyslexia. After several legislative attempts, SB 691 finally got some legs and was incorporated into SB 114, which was the TK to 12 Education Omnibus trailer bill that was signed into law on July 10th, 2023. So the bill was moving along pretty positively, and then the governor included it in the trailer bill, and it became law, which is a very easy way to have it move forward. As a result of the bill, four things were going to happen. First, the State Board of Education developed evaluation criteria and appointed a panel of independent experts, and that happened in January 2024. That independent expert panel worked for almost a year, and they approved a list of 4 selected screening instruments. There was an RFP that went out. They looked at all of stuff. They analyzed the data they each provided, and they came up with the 4 that they approved. And that happened in December of 2024. Then local education agencies, which is the fancy word for school districts, were required to formally adopt the screener their district was going to use by this past June. We're not really sure if they all knew they actually had to take formal action, but we're trying to track down who chose what. And then the LEAs or school districts will begin the annual screening of students in grades kindergarten, first and second. And then the other big piece of the requirement is that the results need to be shared with parents or guardians no later than 45 days after the date of the screening. So that creates the context of the bill. To kind of get into really what are these tests? Because there seems to be a lot of confusion about, do they diagnose dyslexia and the like. So screening assessments are just brief snapshots, analogous to when you go to the doctor and they take your temperature and your blood pressure, and they indicate if the learner is on track or not. So the reading screeners assess the skills that are the building blocks of reading and compare them to benchmarks for that grade level. And they're usually 3 checkpoints: beginning of the year, middle of the year, and end of the year. And the screener informs if the child is above or at, below, or far below the benchmark. This feedback then helps the teacher to see which children need additional support in those building blocks of reading. And the goal is to reduce the prevalence of reading impairments, including dyslexia, by taking preventative actions and providing evidence-based interventions in response to the screening delivered in the general education classroom. So you had asked, how long has Decoding Dyslexia, been involved? Universal screening has been one of the key things we've advocated for since we started. And the reason for that is that early intervention is the most effective way for addressing or remediating dyslexia, and also for preventing the social emotional challenges created by the traditional wait to fail model. So just like for other learning disabilities or just overall disabilities, early intervention is key. And just some little factoids that emphasize how important early intervention is. The poor first grader will rarely catch up. The time from birth to age 8 is the critical period for literacy development due to the rapid brain growth and its response to instruction, which, both of those together push the need to start early. And then this other point is just, I think, really important. 90% of children with reading difficulties will achieve grade level in reading if they receive the right help before the end of first grade. And that population of 90% of children includes children with intellectual disabilities and Down syndrome and all kinds. That's a general number.
What kind of intervention would happen typically if the child is flagged?
So the most important thing is that it align with what's called structured literacy or aligned with the science of reading. So a lot of controversy, debate about what does the science of reading mean. It doesn't mean curriculum that's based on one study. It's based on the broad evidence base that's decades long and continuing to develop in what's called the science of reading. And the instruction needs to be direct and systematic and explicit, not just exposing kids to stuff and expecting them to connect the dots. But a typical structured literacy lesson, and again, with the screener, say the child's in kindergarten, there might be only like 3 areas. It would depend on the screener you're using, but typically they would be looking at how is the child's phonemic awareness developing. And phonological awareness is the higher umbrella. Phonemic awareness is individual sounds. In the earliest part, it would be, can they identify the first sound in a word? Then as you get through a greater continuum would be the final sound, the middle sound, and that's where the pinpointing comes down. But so phonemic awareness is a very strong indicator of dyslexia. So that might be an area of need. In a typical structured literacy lesson, you address phonological awareness, just a little bit of activity there, then reviewing letter sounds, then teaching a new letter sound pattern, then a blending routine, and then the opposite of blending is segmenting. So think of blending as putting the word together, segmenting is taking apart, which you need to do to spell it. A sound blending routine, then maybe word sentence dictation, and it could be, it should be word or phrase or sentence depending on where the child is, then applying the new learning, and then connecting it to decodable text. There's often a lot of criticism of structured literacy that it's just teaching words and it doesn't deal with connected text. A good structured literacy program absolutely deals with connected text because the kid has to apply it to real reading, right? There's not as much emphasis on reading, whole books, but that's perfectly okay if that's what the program does. That's one of the ways to kind of compromise, the critique, because it absolutely is appropriate to be reading words, phrases, sentences, but it's all done in this building block kind of way, as opposed to what a lot of schools have been doing for the last decade or two, where you're just starting with connected text. And for a kid who's reading, all those words on the page is just kind of too much. It's overwhelming. So starting with the smallest unit, sound, then word, then syllable maybe in there, but it's all growing and it's in a very structured, systematic way. Kid does not have to guess about how to put it together.
If your child doesn't already have an IEP or any diagnosed disability, and you get the letter that the risk was flagged, do you think that a parent should ask them to be tested for dyslexia, that they should be evaluated?
I think that's way too extreme a response to the screeners. I mean, remember that they're just snapshots, and what it does is it alerts the teacher that more work needs to be done, because depending on how much exposure a child has had, if they're an English language learner, if there are some other issues, they just might not be, up to par with the benchmark. So typically you would address the needs through just classroom instruction, additional classroom instruction. A lot of schools have a, just right time kind of time where they group kids for additional work, or could be addressed in a more official tier 2 where they might go to somebody as part of a small group, but all of that in the general education program. And it should include progress monitoring so you have an idea of if it's helping. And then depending on the age of the student or how extreme they are from the benchmark, they might do additional diagnostic assessment to pinpoint what part of the scope and sequence do we need to drill down on. So you're not just starting from the very beginning if they have some initial skills down pat, and then it's so that it can be targeted. Also, it would be hugely expensive if every child who was at risk now went and got an assessment. And it's also important to know that schools don't assess for dyslexia. They assess for special education eligibility, which includes specific learning disability, which in reading is dyslexia. But all of that depth and the time it takes to put the kid through all that really isn't necessary at this stage. It would be like you have high blood pressure and they send you off to have some extreme surgery. And I think as schools really build out their multi-tiered systems of support, this kind of distinction will all kind of become one system. You could provide tier three services in gen ed or in special education. The key is that the child is getting a structured literacy approach. It doesn't need a special curriculum if the initial curriculum is good. In fact, it's actually better if the child is using the same routines and the same language and the same terminology, rather than getting one kind of instruction in the classroom and then something else over in the special education services, which is part of the problem in the current situation, is that child then has a hard time putting it all together.
Those students who might already know that they, or anticipate that they have a reading difficulty when they get to these screenings in kindergarten. So students who may have been diagnosed with autism as toddlers, students who are deaf and hard of hearing, or who have a vision impairment, or students with intellectual disabilities. Students with Down syndrome would be another example, where we might expect a reading difficulty. When we come to these screenings, are these screenings going to be able to tell us anything about those children?
One thing we do know is, and there's more new research, and I know Stanford's been doing some work around this, is that students with intellectual disabilities and complex communication needs and other types of disabilities can also have dyslexia. And so sometimes reading issues, I think, can be attributed just to the primary disability, which can kind of mask treatable reading disorders like dyslexia. So we don't want to not screen or think that because we've done certain assessments, that covers all the bases. We want to make sure that we use all the tools in our toolkit in order to make sure that students get all the different supports that they need. And especially because the screener is done in general education, right? Or just across the board, but in general education classrooms. And so we do want general education teachers to also feel comfortable screening all of their students so that they get to know how they're doing. And then when something does need to be done, like something comes up in the screener that they may have a predisposition, that can of course be talked about with the IEP team, but certainly we don't want to opt out or limit this opportunity to know more about our students, to maybe get a new clue that we didn't know before.
Do you think that these screeners are going to be able to kind of help the IEP team find specific areas where we might have missing skills, or we might need additional instruction?
I think it's possible. And I also think it's important to note that a student may have an IEP, but it doesn't mean that they couldn't benefit from tier 2 and tier 3 instruction based on a different type of disability than maybe was identified initially in their IEP. So we don't want them to have to go away to get all their services. They could really get probably a lot of benefit in many cases from being from getting the same types of interventions that students without disabilities get, that are also identified as maybe having a predisposition, because the screener isn't screening for disability. The screener is screening for some clues. There may be something going on we want to pay attention to. We want to do more to make sure that we teach kids how to read, and we don't just think everyone learns the same and those types of things.
What if the teacher says, well, this is designed to tell where a student is up to in this way of teaching a child to read, whereas we've been teaching your child to read functional sight words. So in a sense, it's going to give a false reading. What do you think a parent might respond to that?
We're talking about kindergartners, first graders, and second graders. I don't think we want to limit anyone, especially students that have complex communication needs. We don't know what they're learning in many situations because they don't have full communication access yet. And so operating with the assumption that they are learning and that we're giving them access to language and phonics and phonemic awareness and all the things that come with it. I think, we don't default initially to just sight words. That's a very limited vocabulary, and is, to me, sort of an ableist mindset around, we're going to start you off by limiting you, and then later on say that you're not able to do higher level learning and thinking because you don't have the vocabulary and the ability to read things that we could have actually taught you. And we're really actually seeing that some of our inclusive college programs who are serving our students with intellectual and developmental disabilities in particular, they're getting many students who cannot read. And when they're coming in, they are teaching them to read in college, which tells us that they very much can learn to read, but that we need to do a better job in K-12 giving everyone access and not just saying, well, or that they're using a communication device, and so we're going to limit them by the things on their device, which is what happens often with our students with more extensive support needs. We also don't want to limit a student's ability, like that early language and early literacy, the access to it, just like with our multilingual learners, is so critical. And, I would ask, why wouldn't we give them access to tier 2 and tier 3 interventions, even if we suspected something, whether or not they had intellectual or developmental disabilities, because we don't know to what degree all those things are entangled. So why wouldn't we operate with the assumption that everyone can learn, everyone can get some degree of literacy? We don't know for sure with any kid what they're capable of, but let's assume that they're all capable, and give them access to all the things, and not just what I worry about is that a general ed teacher might have students with disabilities in their class and say, well, these are my gen ed kids, quotes, I say that with quotes, these are my special ed, my students with disabilities, those are going to be served by special ed and ed specialists, so I don't need to worry about them because they're going to take care of that stuff. What we want to see is students that are fully included and that are getting the full range of MTSS and RTI in their classrooms, where they're getting lots of visual supports and those kinds of things, in order to fully digest literacy and comprehension and higher level learning and thinking, so that we're not at college saying, wow, look, they could have learned, they could have been reading all this time and then had access to so much more. And now they're taking college level courses and they're understanding things like, we just don't know what people are capable of. And I think the limits that we're putting on especially that population of students is our own mindset limits. And I hope that we don't see that. So I'm hoping that parents don't opt their students out, and instead of allowing a team to ask if they're going to do the assessment, ask how they're going to. How are we going to do these screeners or this screening, in addition to some of the other types of assessments that we do that won't always pull out a predisposition, especially if you're not looking for something.